Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Andrew Tabler.
Great to be with you.
All right, Andrew, just so everybody gets a sense of who you are and where you came from, just maybe start by telling us a little bit about your personal experience living under the Assad regime in Syria.
Sure. Well, in a younger day, between 2001 and 2008, I lived in Syria and Lebanon. I traveled the Damascus Road every week. I knew the Assads, worked for a charity which was sort of under the patronage of Ismail Assad that dealt with women's issues and rural poverty. And I helped start the country's first English language magazine called Syria Today, now defunct. And was there on the ground for during the Bush administration and watched America's pressure war with the Assad regime, and then was finally kicked out of Syria for writing on the opposition in 2008. And I've been in Washington and in government service on and off ever since.
And we thank you for that service. All right, so Andrew, what the hell just happened?
Yeah, so it's a great question. As best I can tell, it's that the Assad regime, which was extremely brittle, just finally gave way. It gave way for three reasons. One, Bashar al-Assad never made any concessions throughout the war with his own people. Instead, he went up the escalatory ladder using chemical weapons and other strategic weapons on civilians and other groups in the country. And so, therefore, he never was able to change the way he governed, which caused him to lose control of the country in the first place in 2011 following the Syrian uprising. But there were two other major changes. They were in terms of the groups in the countries that were supporting him in this effort. One was Iran and Hezbollah. Iran and Hezbollah came to Assad's aid in 2012. They helped prop up the regime and keep it from collapsing. And the other one is Russia, which came into Syria in 2015 in support of the Assad regime and Iranian and Hezbollah forces. During the last week, with the onslaught or the offensive of HTS from Northwest Syria, an opposition group, an FTO, foreign terrorist organization, the Assad regime lines broke. And so that's not exactly unusual in the Syria context. What was unusual was that Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia did not come to Assad's assistance, therefore led to a catastrophic collapse of the regime's lines in the north, and then finally down the spine of the country to Damascus, and dramatically last night with Assad's departure by plane to the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah, remarkable. And of course, the Russians couldn't come to Assad's aid because, well, they're dealing with a war in Ukraine that they've been bogged down in. The Iranians also have their hands full and actually took some pretty serious blows from the Israelis back in October. And then, of course, Hezbollah has just been knocked around by the Israelis as well. So it's regional wars actually initiated by all those actors that ultimately prevented them from coming to the assistance of the Assad regime, which, of course, itself has been part of the war effort, at least for supplying aid and weapons to Hezbollah. But I do want to ask you about HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as the Nusra Front, which is identified as an al-Qaeda affiliate group based in Syria. There are those who are saying right now that this is a moderate group, or it's pragmatic, or it's less of a threat. What's your assessment of this group, and where's it getting the weapons, the funding, and the training needed to rout the entire country of Syria in about a week?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So HTS, which was, originally came out of Jabhat al-Nusra, as you mentioned, an al-Qaeda affiliate, but it renounced al-Qaeda years ago. And during that period of time, and after renouncing al-Qaeda, its leader, Mohammed Julani, he decided to go off in a different direction, right? He decided to go off in a more moderate direction, one that was like more pragmatic. And he began a campaign to moderate his narrative, so to speak. Now, how much that actually changed the ultimate goals of the group is really up for debate, right? In terms of, how much of different is it now from what it was in a sort of previous manifestation. There's another assessment, though, that's important as well, and that is to what degree are they pointed at the United States in terms of their overall operations, right? And these things get into two different judgments, and these are judgments that I can't make because I'm not in government currently. One is a legal justification, right? Like, how does this group or whatever becomes next when it changes its name, how do we regard it? And then two, I think it's a political decision. Do we decide that HTS has changed its stripes enough, or its way of operating and its posture vis-a-vis the United States to recognize it as a part of the solution in Syria, if not the ultimate outcome or the ruler in Damascus? It's pretty early days to determine that, but I think that's kind of where the debate's been going.
Yeah, and so okay, now let's just back up for a minute, talking about where this group has got its cash, where it's got its weapons, its training. We're hearing that it's not hard to see that they started up north in the country, which borders with or is near the border with Turkey. So that appears to be the supply lines. I think we can say with some certainty that this is a Turkish initiative of sorts, so a war by proxy through HTS, but backed by the Turks. But then we're also, at least this is the scuttlebutt in the region, that it's Qatari money that's backing this. What are you hearing about how this group has got its resources in order to pull off the astounding feat that it has just accomplished?
Yeah, so I think you're right about the proximity to Turkey. HTS is supplied via Turkey. The areas, it's adjacent to Hatay. So its operations, I think, are pretty well known, by Turkey. Now, the degree to which, so during the first Trump administration, whenever we did not deal directly with HTS because it was an FTO, we mostly just reached out to the Turks to help sort of urge them to deal with HTS and to sort of try and moderate their behavior or at least communicate with them. So I think the Turkish involvement is pretty clear. As for the funding, it becomes, I think, much more hazy. Of course, Qatar and Turkey both fund groups that are in the north. There are two primary groups. One is HTS, which you just talked about. The other one is the Syrian National Army. And the Syrian National Army is the one that is running alongside of HTS. And they are very much under the rubric of what we would call in government Turkish-supported opposition directly, and that they involve Turkish forces, which are nearby. And the combination of these two groups has been extremely effective on the battlefield, right? So while it's very difficult to determine where the actual funding is going, the funding from the north, it's very clear that Turkey's involved. It's very clear that they see both HTS and the SNA as effective forces, right? And that they've bet on them as horses in the overall Syria race. And that's pretty much undeniable. However, I will say this. The problem that we have now now and then going forward is that we're going back in time to an earlier part in the Syrian uprising when a whole host of money and influence flowed into Syria to support various groups and factions inside of the country. And that led to a sort of free-for-all and also a growth of jihadist groups in there. The United States, as you know, John, decided not to arm and organize the Syrian opposition in the summer of 2012. That was Barack Obama's decision. Instead, we allowed our allies to do so instead. So we should anticipate a back to the future kind of scenario, I think, in that different regional countries are going to probably be betting on different factions, whether it's HTS or the SNA or other factions which are in the South and throughout the country.
So, all right, before I move on from this, I do want to just maybe pull on one thread. When we look back at the funding of the Nusra Front and some of these other groups, when President Obama declined to back them, one of those countries to emerge as a key backer of all of this, and of course, this is a decade ago, but it was the Qataris. And we also know that the renaming of the Nusra Front to HTS was also a Qatari initiative. They did the same thing, by the way, with Hamas. They were trying to kind of rebrand the group and make it appear a bit more moderate amidst the tumult of the Arab spring. So are you saying right now we just don't have any indications of it, but of course we know what the past is? There's nothing right now that can show us at least a sense of what the money trails look like?
It's very difficult for me to say. And I'm saying that honestly because I think there are two reasons. One is I'm not in government service, so it's kind of hard for me to determine. The second one is, to your point, I think a lot of times groups do a very good job of covering their tracks of who supports them. So while I think that Turkey and Qatar are very heavily coming in the north and among the groups in the north, as you mentioned, it's very hard for me to follow the exact money trail. You'd have to go to the experts for that, which would be organizations like FDD or elsewhere. There are people that track these things, really in a detailed way for a living. I unfortunately have been tasked with the overall Syria file for the better part of my career, and certainly for the last few days. So I'm waiting to hear from the experts and people that have drilled down on this to understand not just where we came from in the past, but where we might be going in the future with whoever ends up ruling Damascus.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple other questions I want to ask you before we let you go, and I'm going to try to squeeze all of this in as much as possible. We're going to go a little longer here, folks, than I think we normally do because this is just fascinating stuff. So I guess next question that I have for you is what happens to those Shia militias, right? We know there were a bunch of them that were based there, the PMUs as they were known, the Popular Mobilization Units, or Hashd Shabi as they're called. Where have they just melted away into Iraq? Are they melted away into the countryside? What do we think has happened to these Iran-backed fighters?
Well, there are Iran-backed fighters and have been throughout the course of the war in what were formerly regime-held areas in the western part of the country. But not only, there's a huge garrison of them to the west of the Euphrates River between Deir ez-Zor and Abu Kamal. It's a huge cluster of these forces. And they have been, for the better part of the last year, while the Hamas-Israel war has been raging and so on, they've been busy attacking U.S. forces. Those, at the same time that was going on for the last year, Israeli airstrikes inside of Syria, particularly inside of regime-held areas of Syria, or formerly regime-held areas of Syria now, they increased by fourfold. And then the last 2 months, they then quadrupled again. These strikes were designed and targeted at two major centers. One were sort of heavy weapons and more sophisticated weapons systems. That's one. And two were against the Shia militia fighters themselves. So over the course of the last few months in particular, but over the course of the last year, the capabilities of these fighters have decreased, and their ability to come to the Assad regime's assistance has also decreased. And so while they're still around, they are much, much less in number and maybe more manageable for the moment as this sort of new revolution or the second version of the revolution unfolds.
Right. And also, I think the same can be said for what's going on with Hezbollah. They've lost a lot in Lebanon, and those that were the Hezbollah fighters that were in Syria appear to have, I guess, crossed back over the border. They appear to be nowhere in sight. Which I think also contributed to the downfall of the regime. Let me ask you about Israel. I think we're hearing a lot of questions about what might happen next. The Israelis have amassed forces along the Golan Heights. They've actually taken over the buffer zone in the Golan area that had been sort of previously a no man's land between the Syrian regime and the Israeli government. What do you expect from this new Sunni, whatever we're calling this? It's not quite a regime yet, but those in power right now in Syria, do you expect them to turn their sights on Israel? Do you expect there to be a skirmish or something worse than that on that border?
For the moment, probably not. They're much obsessed, I think, and inwardly focused. And so probably not. There's also the fact that the Golan and sort of where Israeli forces are makes them sort of, there's a very advantageous vantage point from there to deal with such, cross-border activities. Israel has had to do that throughout the Hamas-Israel war, but there have been very few attacks. Now, I think going forward, though, the way that governments in Damascus often legitimate themselves, especially when they are unable to deliver for their people, is they do so through the resistance narrative and through attacking Israel. The question is whether these groups, the new sort of, like whether it's HTS or other Sunni-backed groups, will they resort to this old playbook to get legitimacy and to somehow capitalize on sort of this war with Israel? It's a really good question. I think it would be easier to return to that playbook had the last, 13 odd years or so of the Syrian civil war not happened, when Hezbollah and Iranian militia came in and supported the Assad regime. Sunnis were getting slaughtered wholesale by Shia militia from Lebanon, from throughout the region. And I don't think they're going to forget that. So they might regard those forces as the biggest threat and not Israel. And perhaps that will be what, holds the day for now. But we just simply don't know what's coming out of Damascus, and we need to watch very closely. I'm sure the Israelis are too. They're very shrewd sort of players in the Syria sphere, but it's a major change in the chessboard, one we haven't seen for 54 odd years. And I'm sure that Syria is going to be the center of a lot of attention in the coming 4 years under the Trump administration.
Oh, yeah. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I will say, of course, we know that the Israelis have, or at least reportedly, struck chemical weapons production sites, other Iranian missile production facilities, as well as weapons caches, which is, I guess it's all to be expected. I don't know whether the new rulers of Damascus, if we can call them that, if they saw that as a hostile act or a preventive one. We do know, of course, that they have sent messages to the Israelis saying, we're not out for you, we're only out for the Assad regime. So that may keep the fighting down to a low simmer, if there's any at all. But of course, we just don't know. But last question for you here, Andrew, before I let you go. Just if you're to try to look into a crystal ball here, now, I know it's not easy to say what comes next out of this, but there are those right now who are saying that the Sunni jihadi factions that have taken over Damascus and taken over the vast majority of Syria, they're consolidating control, and we're going to see sort of a Syria that is under one roof, so to speak. There are others that are saying that there's only one way forward, and that's to create various cantons, sectarian cantons, Alawite, Sunni, Kurd, etc. That's another way of looking at the future of this country that is certainly not homogenous in any way, right? The other one is that you could see the balkanization of this country, having it break down into small fiefdoms controlled by clan, family, tribe, sectarian leaders, etc. If you could guess, where do you think this goes?
For the time being, it's going to be a divided country, as it's been for the better part of the last decade or so. I don't think that's going to change. And I think it's just going to be a sphere of influence model. Whether it's a balkanization permanently, I don't know. But at least in the near term, I think it's going to be divided. And that's just because of the way the forces shook out. The war didn't lead, ultimately to regime victory, although many people thought that that's the route it was going to go. Instead, the country was sort of partitioned between basically five, different militaries in one way, shape, or form. You had the Russians and the Iranians with the regime. You had the Turks in the north. You had the U.S. In the west, and you had Israel from the air. And that sort of, five armies model was the way that the war shook out, and that divided the country into parts of, zones of influence. I don't think that's going to change until we see a viable government in Damascus or the invasion of a neighboring country, which would completely end the war. At least in a certain swath of the country. But I don't see anybody really wanting to do that. So, for example, you had mentioned, Turkey about, coming in, their support for groups in the north. And there has been a lot of saber rattling vis-a-vis the Syrian Democratic Forces in the eastern part of the country. So while Turkey could very much move into northeast Syria, which are areas that are adjacent to where the U.S. operates, I've never met a Turkish official who wanted to go the whole way down river and take over all the areas that the SDF administers, between Deir ez-Zor and Abu Kamal. That's where ISIS, has sort of its base historically and could regenerate. And instead, I think its interests are further north. So I anticipate a divided Syria for the near to medium term, with a possibility of balkanization into the long term.
All right. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. I think we can probably safely say that the big losers were Iran and Russia, primarily, maybe Hezbollah, the broader Iranian axis. but unclear who the winners are yet, and certainly unclear what happens after this. Andrew Tabler, thank you very much for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
My pleasure.